Lesson 31, the President's Job. The roles of the President. His main job is Chief Executive, to carry out the laws passed by Congress. The President takes an oath of office to execute those laws, carry them out. Examples of responsibilities would be appointing someone to serve as head of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, holding a cabinet meeting to discuss government business, reading reports about problems of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 2, the President is legislative leader. He puts together a legislative agenda that members of his own party will introduce in Congress. The President's administration works in conjunction with members in his own party in Congress to introduce legislation, bills that will become laws. So the President is legislative leader. As legislative leader, the President signs bills into laws or vetoes legislation. He calls Congress into special session. Examples of responsibilities: inviting members of Congress to lunch in the White House, signing a bill of Congress, making a speech in Congress. 3, the President is Commander-in-Chief of all branches of the military. Commander-in-Chief. Examples of responsibilities: inspecting a naval yard, deciding in wartime whether to bomb foreign cities, calling out troops to stop a riot at the request of the state legislature or governor. 4, the President is head of state. He represents the country, a living symbol of the nation. It's considered a great honor for any citizen to shake the President's hand. Here's President Obama, former President Obama, meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Taro Aso. This was the first head of state that former President Obama invited to the White House. Head of state. And here's President Obama meeting with the women's national champions basketball team, and meeting with the men's national champions, Carolina Tar Heels, when Tyler Hansbrough played for Carolina. Examples of responsibilities as head of state: awarding medals to winners of college scholarships, congratulating astronauts on their journey into space, greeting visitors to the White House, making a patriotic speech on the 4th of July. 5, the President is party leader. He heads or leads his party. He's the embodiment of his party. Examples of responsibilities: choosing leading party members to serve in the cabinet to work along with him, traveling to California to speak at a rally for a party nominee to the U.S. Senate. Number 6, the President is chief diplomat. The President decides what American diplomats and ambassadors shall say to foreign governments. With the help of advisors, the President makes the foreign policy of the United States. He's the chief diplomat. Number 7, the economic leader. Examples of responsibilities: meeting with economic advisors to discuss ways to reduce unemployment, meeting with business and labor leaders to discuss their needs and problems. Economic leader. In the State of the Union address, each year the president informs Congress of the important issues facing the country and proposes new programs, new policies, informs Congress what bills he would like to see introduced and passed and sent to his desk for signature into law. Former President Bush giving State of the Union address, the President of the Senate located above his right shoulder to our left, Dick Cheney, and the former Speaker of the House over President Bush's left shoulder to our right was then Democrat Nancy Pelosi. When the president delivers a State of the Union address, it's to a joint session of Congress. The most important role, though, of the president is that of chief executive. That's his main job. Again, in his oath of office, he takes that oath to execute the laws passed by Congress and enforce the laws under the Constitution. The president is in charge of the entire executive branch of government, including the 15 executive departments. The heads of those departments make up the president's cabinet. There are 3 million federal government workers working in the executive branch of government. We will have a separate lesson on that forthcoming. The president nominates the cabinet heads. He doesn't appoint them, he nominates them because the Senate has to approve them. They form his cabinet, these 15 executive heads. They're called secretaries. The Senate must approve them. Here's former President Obama meeting with his cabinet. The president nominates federal judges, including Supreme Court justices. This is not the current court because Justice Anton Scalia had passed. And President Trump had the opportunity to nominate a Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch. We will talk more about that when we get to the judicial branch in the Supreme Court. President Obama had the opportunity to nominate 2 Supreme Court justices while he was president. They were both confirmed by the Senate. Justice Sonia Sotomayor was his first nominee when there was a vacancy, and Justice Elena Kagan was his second nominee. And again, President Trump had the opportunity to nominate Neil Gorsuch, who was then confirmed by the Senate. As chief executive, the president will issue executive orders. These are presidential commands that have the force of law. Former President Obama issued many executive orders because he had difficulty getting favorable legislation in his eyes passed through Congress. President Trump has also, to this point, issued many executive orders as well. The president can issue pardons. These are declarations of forgiveness and freedom from punishment to individuals who have broken federal law, and grant reprieves. This is a delay in a person's punishment until a higher court can hear the case, and also grant amnesty. This is a pardon for a group of people. Some examples of these in the past: President Truman, his executive order number 9981 in 1948 established equality of treatment in the military. Very famous executive order. Now, therefore, by virtue of the authority vested in me as President of the United States, by the Constitution and the statutes of the United States, and as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Services, it is hereby ordered as follows. The policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. This policy shall be put into effect as rapidly as possible. Again, this was a very famous executive order by President Truman, which basically desegregated the military. Famous presidential pardon was President Nixon, who had to resign in the wake of the Watergate scandal, August of 1974. The new president, Gerald Ford, gave Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he may have committed while in office. President Ford was the vice president of Richard Nixon, who became president once President Nixon resigned. And then less than a month later, President Ford granted a pardon to President Nixon, so he could not be prosecuted for any crimes he may have committed as president. This was all during the Watergate scandal back in the mid-'70s. Presidential reprieve, an example of this was George W. Bush's reprieve of Scooter Libby, who was the chief of staff for his vice president, Dick Cheney. It says, I am commuting the portion of Mr. Libby's sentence that required him to spend 30 months in prison. In other words, reduced that time in prison. Gave him a reprieve for that. He still had to pay a huge fine, but he did not have to serve in prison because of the reprieve. Presidential amnesty. Jimmy Carter, we mentioned this one. On his first day in office, January 20th, 1977, he granted unconditional amnesty for all Vietnam War-era draft dodgers. So if you avoided the draft or burned your draft card or left the country, you were granted amnesty, forgiveness for that crime. As Commander-in-Chief, the President is in charge of all branches of the armed forces. Only Congress can declare war, but only the President can order troops into battle. President Obama in Iraq, former President Obama. Congress has declared war only 5 times in our nation's history, but presidents have deployed troops over 150 times. The War Powers Act requires the president to notify Congress immediately when troops are sent into battle, and they can stay there basically 2 months or 60 days before they need congressional approval. Otherwise, they have to be withdrawn. The War Powers Act was passed in the early 70s as an attempt by Congress to try to limit the president's authority as commander-in-chief just to send troops indefinitely anywhere around the world. Our next lesson will go into detail about the president as commander-in-chief.